The story of Francisco Félix de Sousa is unlike any other in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Because this is the story of a man who didn't just traffic in human beings. He created a dynasty. He founded a community. He became part of African royalty while remaining connected to Brazil and Europe. He practiced both Catholicism and Vodun. He built an empire that lasted decades and created a family that still dominates the city of Huida in modern-day Benin. And he did it all by perfecting the mechanics of buying and selling human beings at the exact moment when the trade was being outlawed by every major Western power. Francisco Félix de Sousa was born on October 4, 1754, in Salvador da Bahia, Brazil, then the heart of Portuguese colonial America. According to his descendants, he was the 8th-generation descendant of Tomé de Sousa, the first Governor-General of Brazil and founder of Salvador itself. If that's true, and historians debate whether it is, then Francisco Félix came from Portuguese nobility, from a family with deep roots in colonial administration and power. But even if that genealogy is embellished, what's clear is that he came from a world built on sugar and slavery, a world where the wealth of Bahia depended entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic. Young Francisco's early life in Brazil is poorly documented. We don't know much about his childhood, his education, or what exactly led him to leave Brazil for Africa. Some sources suggest he left under some kind of cloud, possibly as a criminal or an exile. Others suggest he was simply a merchant seeking opportunities. What we do know is that around 1792, when he was approximately 38 years old, Francisco Félix de Sousa made his first journey to the West African coast, specifically to Huida in what was then the Kingdom of Dahomey. Huida. The name might not mean much to most people today, but in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was one of the most important ports in the entire Atlantic slave trade. Less than a mile from its center lay the beach where more than 1 million people, by conservative estimates, were loaded onto ships and transported to the Americas. Huida was the slave-trading hub for the Kingdom of Dahomey, one of the most powerful West African states of its era, and it was here that Francisco Félix de Sousa would make his fortune and his name. That first trip to Africa lasted about 3 years. De Sousa returned to Brazil, but something had changed. He'd seen the opportunities, understood the systems, made the connections. Around 1800, he returned to West Africa, this time permanently. His brother, Jacinto José de Sousa, had been serving as the governor of the Portuguese fort at Huida, the fortress of São João Batista de Arruda. When Jacinto died in 1804, Francisco Félix assumed control of the fort and, more importantly, control of the Portuguese slave trading operations in the region. Now, let's be clear about what Huida was in the early 19th century. It wasn't some remote outpost. It was an international commercial center, a place where African, Brazilian, Portuguese, French, and British merchants all competed for human cargo. The Kingdom of Dahomey, which controlled the interior territories behind Huida, had built its power and wealth on the slave trade. Dahomey's army conducted raids deep into the interior, capturing people who would then be marched to the coast and sold to European and Brazilian traders. The fort that de Sousa controlled wasn't large, but it was strategically crucial. It gave him legitimacy, a base of operations, storage for goods, and protection. From this position, he began building his trading empire. He established relationships with Dahomeyan authorities. He learned the local languages, including Fon, the language of Dahomey, He formed alliances with African merchants and rulers, and he started accumulating wealth. But in the early 1810s, de Sousa ran into a problem. King Adandozan of Dahomey. Different accounts give different reasons for their conflict. Some say it was over an unpaid debt. Some say it was a dispute over trading privileges. Some say de Sousa insulted the king by traveling to the capital at Ebome to demand money he was owed. Whatever the cause, King Adandozan had Francisco Félix de Sousa arrested and imprisoned. The punishment was brutal. According to Dahomeyan tradition, de Sousa was repeatedly dunked in a large jar of indigo dye, a process that stained his skin blue and was designed to humiliate him. He was kept in prison, and it looked like his African career might be over before it really began. But de Sousa was smart, and he was patient, and he understood power. In prison, de Sousa made contact with Prince Gakpe, King Adandozan's half-brother. Gakpe was ambitious, charismatic, and had his own grievances against the king. Together, they hatched a plot. De Sousa promised to support Gakpe in overthrowing Adandozan. In return, Gakpe promised to give de Sousa unprecedented trading privileges if he became king. In 1818, the coup succeeded. Gakpe took the throne and became King Gezo, one of the most important rulers in Dahomeyan history. And Francisco Félix de Sousa was released from prison and elevated to a position of extraordinary power and privilege. Gezo gave him a virtual monopoly on slave exports from Ouida. He gave him the title of Chacha, a term of respect that may have originated from de Sousa's habit of saying ja, ja, Portuguese for right away, as if to emphasize his reliability and promptness in business. The title Chacha would become hereditary in the de Sousa family. To this day, the family patriarch holds this title. It confers no official governmental power, but it commands enormous social and cultural respect. When the current Chacha speaks, people in Ouida listen. The Ao position Francisco Félix created for himself transcended commerce. It became a form of African chieftainship held by a Brazilian-born man and passed down through his descendants. With King Gezo's support and his monopoly position, de Sousa transformed the slave trade out of Ouida. This wasn't the old model of European forts competing with each other. This was a rationalized, streamlined operation. Dahomey's army would conduct raids, and the captives would be brought to Ouida. There, de Sousa and his agents would handle the commercial transactions, the record-keeping, the negotiations with ship captains, the loading of human cargo. He served as the intermediary between African suppliers and American buyers. The scale of the operation is difficult to pin down precisely because by this time, most of the trade was illegal. Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1807. The United States did the same in 1808. Portugal and Brazil officially prohibited it in stages between 1815 and 1850, though enforcement was weak or non-existent. Spain officially ended it in its colonies, but the trade didn't stop. It went underground, and men like Francisco Félix de Sousa became experts at evading the British Royal Navy patrols that tried to intercept slave ships. Ouida's location helped. The coastline was treacherous, with sandbars and surf that made it difficult for large warships to approach. Slaves were loaded onto small boats that could navigate the shallow waters, then transferred to larger ships waiting offshore. The ships themselves were often registered under false flags, with forged papers claiming their human cargo consisted of free workers or indentured servants. Captains developed elaborate strategies for avoiding British patrols, changing routes, traveling at night, using lookouts on shore to warn of approaching warships. And, through it all, Francisco Félix de Sousa prospered. His trading connections extended across the Atlantic. He had partnerships and agents in Bahia, in Cuba, in Haiti, in various Caribbean ports. His bills of exchange, essentially promissory notes backed by his reputation and his assets, were accepted in Liverpool, in New York, in Marseille, in London. Think about that. The financial centers of the Western world, in nations where the slave trade had been legally abolished, where politicians gave speeches about humanitarian values and Christian morality, those same centers happily did business with one of the most prolific illegal slave traders operating anywhere in the world. De Sousa became extraordinarily wealthy. He built a vast compound in Whydah, a complex of buildings that served as his residence, his business headquarters, his fortress. The architecture reflected his Afro-Brazilian identity, blending Portuguese colonial styles with local African elements. Multiple buildings housed his wives, his children, his concubines, his employees, his household slaves. Because, yes, de Sousa himself owned slaves who worked his properties, managed his estates, served in his household. He employed European staff, African staff, mixed-race staff. His compound was like a small town unto itself, and the family grew. By all accounts, de Sousa had at least 80 children, though some estimates put the number even higher. He maintained a large harem, taking wives and concubines from various African ethnic groups. This wasn't just about personal desire, though that was certainly part of it. These marriages and relationships created kinship ties, political alliances, connections to different communities throughout the region. Each wife's family became part of de Sousa's extended network. Each child was a living link between the Brazilian, Portuguese, and African worlds. European visitors who met de Sousa in his later years left fascinating accounts. They described a man who consciously cultivated a hybrid identity. He was Catholic, attending Mass regularly, supporting the Church, but he also practiced Vodun, the traditional religion of Dahomey. He had his own family shrine, his own religious observances that blended African and Christian elements. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was syncretism, the merging of different belief systems into something new. And it was typical of the Afro-Brazilian community that de Sousa helped create in West Africa. Because de Sousa wasn't alone. He was part of a wave of Brazilian and Portuguese traders, many of them former slaves themselves or descendants of slaves, who returned to West Africa in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and created Afro-Brazilian communities. These communities had their own distinct culture, architecture, cuisine, religious practices. They spoke Portuguese. They built houses in Brazilian styles with distinctive two-story structures and painted in bright colors. They cooked Brazilian dishes, feijoada, moqueca, dishes with rice and beans and palm oil. They celebrated Catholic feast days and Vodun ceremonies with equal fervor. Today, descendants of these Afro-Brazilian communities, called Agudas, are prominent families throughout Benin, Togo, Nigeria, and Ghana. The de Sousa family is the most famous, but there are many others. Joaquim d'Almeida, Domingos José Martins, Juan José de Lima, all Brazilian slave traders who followed de Sousa's model and built their own fortunes. These families still identify as Afro-Brazilian, still maintain connections to Brazil, still preserve elements of that hybrid culture created 2 centuries ago. Francisco Félix de Sousa worked hard to cultivate a reputation as a benevolent figure. European visitors noted that he tried to reduce human sacrifice in Dahomey, speaking out against some of the kingdom's more brutal customs. He was known for his hospitality to European travelers, hosting elaborate dinners with imported wine, serving feijoada and Brazilian rum, greeting visiting French princes with 21 cannon salutes from the artillery pieces he kept at his compound. He sent his youngest son to study in Portugal. He used silver cutlery and monogrammed porcelain. In 1846, the Portuguese government decorated him with the Order of Christ, calling him a distinguished patriot. Even the British vice-consul in Dahomey, John Duncan, a man whose job was to suppress the slave trade that de Sousa represented, called him the most generous and most humane man of the coasts of Africa. How do we reconcile that? How was someone actively engaged in one of the most brutal businesses in human history, simultaneously seen as generous and humane? The answer is that Francisco Félix de Sousa, like many successful slave traders, was skilled at compartmentalization. Within his own social circle, within his household, within his dealings with Europeans and African elites, he could be charming, generous, hospitable, even kind. He wasn't personally wielding the whip or loading people into shipholds. He was a businessman. He sat in his office, negotiated prices, signed contracts, managed accounts. The actual violence, the actual suffering that was happening elsewhere, perpetrated by other people. This is how systems of oppression function. They distribute the violence across so many people and so many stages that no one individual feels fully responsible. The Dahomean soldiers who captured people in raids were just following orders. The African merchants who sold captives to de Sousa were just doing business. De Sousa himself was just an intermediary, connecting sellers to buyers. The ship captains were just transporting cargo. The plantation owners in Brazil and Cuba and Louisiana were just managing their agricultural operations. At every stage, people could tell themselves they were just one small part of a much larger system, that they weren't really responsible for the whole. But let's talk about what that system actually did. Let's talk about the people who passed through Francisco Félix de Sousa's hands. We don't have exact numbers. The documentation for illegal slave trading is by its nature incomplete. Ships' logs were destroyed or falsified. Captains kept 2 sets of books. Traders used code words and aliases. But we can make estimates based on captured ships, court records, missionary accounts, and other sources. From 1818, when de Sousa gained his monopoly, to 1849, when he died, was a period of 31 years. During this time, Ouidah remained one of the most active slave-trading ports on the West African coast. Even conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands of people passed through Ouidah's slave markets during de Sousa's tenure. Some historians believe the number could be much higher, possibly exceeding 100,000 people over the course of his career. 100,000 people. 100,000 men, women, and children, captured in wars or raids or through various forms of treachery, marched to the coast, along what is now called the Route des Esclaves, the slave route, a 3.5-kilometer sandy track from the interior of Ouidah to the beach. They were held in barracoons, wooden holding pens, sometimes for weeks or months, waiting for ships to arrive. They were branded, inspected, treated as livestock. Then they were loaded into small boats and rowed out through the treacherous surf to larger ships waiting offshore. The conditions on those ships were designed to maximize profit by minimizing space. People were packed into holds with barely enough room to lie down, often chained together. Mortality rates during the Middle Passage were horrific. 15, 20, sometimes 25% of the human cargo would die during the voyage. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Some people died of dysentery. Some died of fever. Some died of despair, simply giving up in the face of unbearable suffering. The bodies were thrown overboard. Those who survived the voyage arrived in Brazilian ports, primarily Bahia, but also Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and others, or in Cuban ports like Havana. There they were sold, usually at public auctions, to plantation owners. They would spend the rest of their lives cutting sugarcane, harvesting coffee, working in mines, serving in households. The life expectancy for enslaved workers on Brazilian sugar plantations was brutally short. 7 years, maybe 10 if they were lucky. The system consumed people and needed constant replenishment, which is why the illegal trade continued for so long despite official prohibitions. And Francisco Félix de Sousa profited from every stage of this process. He collected fees from the Dahomean suppliers. He charged the ship captains. He took commissions from the buyers. He provided services like provisions, water, insurance. He was, in essence, the CEO of Uida's slave trading operation. And he lived like royalty. His relationship with King Gezo was central to everything. The two men had made each other. Gezo wouldn't have gained the throne without de Sousa's support. De Sousa wouldn't have achieved his monopoly without Gezo's patronage. They needed each other. And by most accounts, they genuinely respected each other, formed something like a friendship across the vast cultural divide between them. Gezo's reign was remarkable. He ruled Dahomey from 1818 to 1858, 4 decades that saw the kingdom at the height of its military and economic power. Much of that power came from the slave trade. Gezo used the wealth from selling captives to European and Brazilian traders to buy guns, which he used to equip his army, which he used to conduct more raids and capture more people. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, and Francisco Félix de Sousa was the man who made it possible by providing the commercial infrastructure, the international connections, the financial sophistication to turn human suffering into wealth and power. But nothing lasts forever. By the 1840s, the British anti-slavery patrols were intensifying. The West Africa Squadron, the Royal Navy force dedicated to suppressing the slave trade, had dozens of ships operating along the coast. They were capturing more and more slave vessels. They were pressuring African rulers to sign treaties prohibiting the trade. They were attacking slave depots and barracoons, burning facilities, freeing captives. In 1844, when de Sousa was 90 years old, King Gezo began to see him as past his prime. The old Brazilian merchant no longer had the energy and drive he'd once possessed. Gezo started giving trading privileges to other merchants, breaking de Sousa's monopoly. De Sousa adapted. He'd seen the future. The slave trade's days were numbered, at least in its old form. He started investing heavily in palm oil, which was becoming increasingly valuable in European markets as a lubricant for the industrial machines of the Industrial Revolution, and as a raw material for soap and cosmetics. Francisco Félix de Sousa died on May 8, 1849, at the age of 94. His death triggered elaborate mourning ceremonies that lasted for months. According to Dahomean custom, people were sacrificed at his funeral, their spirits sent to serve him in the afterlife. A boy and a girl were beheaded and buried with him. 3 men were sacrificed on the beach at Uida. Hundreds of Dahomey's famous female warriors, the Amazons, spent days firing guns and dancing in the main square. The entire city went into a state of ferment, with drum ceremonies, animal sacrifices, massive quantities of rum distributed, continuous shouting, firing, and dancing from sunset to sunrise. When King Gezo heard of de Sousa's death, he reportedly wept. He'd lost his oldest and most valuable ally. The death marked the end of an era. The slave trade from Ouida would continue for another decade or so, but never with the same organization, the same efficiency, the same international reach that de Sousa had provided. De Sousa left behind a complicated legacy. He left behind a vast family, descendants who would spread throughout West Africa, many of whom became prominent figures in colonial and post-colonial society. He left behind the Afro-Brazilian communities he had helped create. He left behind architectural monuments, buildings that still stand in Ouida today. He left behind cultural practices, religious syncretism, culinary traditions, linguistic influences. The Portuguese language, mixed with Fon and Yoruba and other African languages, is still spoken by some of his descendants. Brazilian dishes are still cooked. Catholic Vodun religious ceremonies still take place. And he left behind memory. Complicated, contested memory. Today, in Ouida, there's a museum dedicated to the de Sousa family. There's a plaza named Place de Chacha, which was the site where enslaved people were auctioned before being marched to the beach. There's a statue of Francisco Félix de Sousa in the city center. Every few decades, the family holds an elaborate ceremony to confer the title of Chacha on a new patriarch. The current Chacha is a direct descendant, part of the 8th or 9th generation of de Sousas in West Africa. But how should we remember Francisco Félix de Sousa? This is where things get complicated, where history becomes contested ground. Because to many of his descendants and to many people in Ouida, de Sousa is a hero. He's the father of the city. He's the founder of the Afro-Brazilian community. He's a successful entrepreneur who built connections between Africa and the Americas. He's a bridge between cultures, a modernizer who brought Western goods and technology to West Africa. When the government of Benin started planning new museums about slavery in the 2000 teens, some members of the de Sousa family vehemently opposed any characterization of their ancestor as a slave merchant. They want him remembered as a great businessman, a builder, a patriarch. They argue that the slave trade was legal in its time, that everyone was doing it, that de Sousa was just a man of his era. They say that dwelling on the slave trading tarnishes the family reputation, that it's unfair to judge historical figures by modern moral standards. Closing sequence. Let's talk about memory and responsibility. Because the story of Francisco Félix de Sousa raises questions that we still struggle with today. How do we remember people who did terrible things in contexts where those things were considered normal? How do we honor cultural heritage when that heritage is built on suffering? How do communities reckon with painful pasts when those pasts are also the source of their identity? In 2018, a reporter from the Washington Post visited Ouida and interviewed members of the de Sousa family. One descendant, Judicael de Sousa, 43 years old, said of his ancestor, "He was a man who helped modernize our nation." Another family member said privately that he personally thought what Francisco Félix had done was wrong, but he worried that other family members would be livid if he said that publicly. The family's reputation is at stake. They don't want to be known for this dirty thing. But here's the fundamental truth we have to confront. Francisco Félix de Sousa didn't just participate in the slave trade. He perfected it. He rationalized it. He created systems and networks that made it more efficient, more profitable, more sustainable. He was, by many accounts, one of the most successful slave traders in history. That's not something to celebrate. That's not something to be proud of. That's a legacy of suffering on a scale almost too large to comprehend. The more than 1 million people who passed through Ouida, the Port de Sousa dominated for 30 years. Those weren't statistics. They were human beings. Each one had a name, a family, a community, a life that was stolen. Each one experienced terror and suffering that we cannot fully imagine. Each one left behind people who mourned them, who never knew what happened to them, who lived with that absence for the rest of their lives. And the effects didn't end with that generation. The children born to enslaved parents inherited that status. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, generations of people lived and died in bondage because of what Francisco Félix de Sousa and men like him did. The descendants of those enslaved people are alive today throughout Brazil, throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Americas. They're still dealing with the legacy of that history, the structural inequalities, the generational trauma, the ongoing effects of systems that were built on the premise that some human beings could be property. The Kingdom of Dahomey, which partnered with de Sousa and profited enormously from the slave trade, also bears responsibility. King Gezo, who gave de Sousa his monopoly, who conducted the raids that provided captives, who built his kingdom's power on selling his own people, he's part of this story too. The African dimension of the slave trade is something that many communities still struggle to acknowledge. There's a tendency to frame the slave trade purely as European and American exploitation of Africa. And it was that. But it was also more complicated. African rulers and merchants were active participants, not just passive victims. They made choices, pursued profits, built power through the trade. Modern Benin is trying to reckon with this history. The government has proposed renaming the Place de Chacha, the square named after de Sousa. They're building new museums about slavery that will tell the full story, not just sanitized versions that protect the reputations of prominent families. They've created the Door of No Return, a monument on the beach where enslaved people were loaded onto ships, a place for remembrance and reflection. They've established a Place du Repentance, a center where Africans can pray for forgiveness for their ancestors' role in the trade. But these efforts face resistance. The de Sousa family is still powerful in Benin. They still command respect. They don't want their ancestors' legacy tarnished. And you can understand their position even if you can't agree with it. These are people whose entire identity is bound up with being descended from this man. The family name, de Sousa, carries prestige throughout West Africa. The title of Chacha is a source of pride. The family compound is a landmark. To fully acknowledge what Francisco Félix de Sousa really was, what he really did, would force a complete rethinking of family identity. One historian interviewed about the de Sousa legacy said, "This is still a country divided between the families of the enslaved and the slave traders. But the elite don't want to talk about what happened here." That division persists not just in Benin, but throughout the African diaspora, throughout the Americas, throughout all the societies shaped by the slave trade. There's a Beninese woman named Matinée de Sousa, sixth-generation direct descendant of Francisco Félix, who has dedicated her life to fighting modern slavery. She gives tours along the slave route in Ouida. She talks about her ancestors' history honestly. She acknowledges what he did, and she's committed herself to making sure it never happens again in any form. She works to combat human trafficking, forced labor, child slavery, all the forms that slavery takes in the 21st century. For her, reckoning with her ancestors' legacy means actively working against the kinds of exploitation he represented. That's one model for how to deal with this history. Acknowledge it fully. Don't hide from it. Don't sanitize it. Don't make excuses. And then commit yourself to something better. Because here's what we can't escape. The wealth and power that families like the Sousas enjoy today, the property they own, the status they hold, all of that was built on the slave trade. It's blood money accumulated over generations. And the poverty and underdevelopment that characterizes much of modern Benin and West Africa more broadly, that's also part of the legacy. The slave trade extracted the region's most valuable resource, its people, for centuries. The social fabric was torn apart. The economic development that could have happened didn't, because labor and talent were being systematically removed and shipped across the ocean. When you walk through Huida today, past the Sousa compound with its Brazilian-style architecture, past the plaza bearing the Chacha's name, past the museum celebrating the family, you're walking through a landscape shaped by slavery. And less than a mile away, you can walk to the beach, to the door of no return, to the place where more than 1 million people took their last steps on African soil. Both of these things are part of the same history. Both of them are true, and we can't understand one without understanding the other. Francisco Félix de Sousa lived for 94 years. For more than half a century, he was one of the most powerful men on the West African coast. He created an empire, founded a dynasty, established communities that persist to this day. He bridged African and Brazilian cultures in ways that shaped the entire Atlantic world. And he did it all by perfecting the machinery of human trafficking. There's no reconciling those things. There's no way to make them fit together comfortably. A man can be personally generous and commercially monstrous. A man can love his children and traffic in other people's children. A man can practice multiple religions and violate the fundamental moral principles of all of them. These contradictions aren't errors in the historical record. They're the truth about how human beings actually work, how societies actually function, how evil actually operates in the real world. The statue of Francisco Félix de Sousa still stands in Huida. His descendants still proudly bear his name and his title. The family compound is still maintained as a heritage site. And every year, tourists visit, drawn by the complex history, by the architectural beauty, by the cultural syncretism that the Afro-Brazilian community represents. But we need to be clear-eyed about what we're looking at. We're looking at the legacy of one of the most successful slave traders in history. We're looking at monuments to a man who profited from immeasurable suffering. We're looking at a system that turned human beings into commodities, and generations of descendants who are still wrestling with what that means. History isn't simple. People aren't simple. The past refuses to be neat and tidy. Francisco Félix de Sousa's story is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront all those complexities at once. It forces us to see how culture and commerce, religion and brutality, family love and systematic exploitation can all coexist in the same person, in the same community, in the same moment. We study figures like Francisco Félix de Sousa, not to condemn one man from 2 centuries ago, though condemnation is certainly warranted. We study them to understand how systems of exploitation function, how they're justified, how they persist, how they shape societies for generations. Because the structures that allowed de Sousa to build his empire, the economic incentives, the cultural normalizations, the moral blind spots, the distribution of violence across so many actors that no one feels fully responsible. Those structures didn't disappear when the slave trade ended. They adapt, they evolve, they take new forms. Understanding Francisco Félix de Sousa. Understanding how a man could be simultaneously the Chacha, the father of Ouida, the patriarch of a great family, and also one of the greatest slave traders who ever lived. That understanding is essential if we want to confront the ongoing legacies of slavery and build something more just. Because the past isn't past. It's present. It's in the economic inequalities that still track the old lines of slavery. It's in the cultural identity of the Afro-Brazilian communities. It's in the families that still bear the slave traders' names and the descendants of enslaved people who still live with that inheritance. It's in the monuments and museums, in the contested memories, in the ongoing arguments about how we should remember and what we should honor. Francisco Félix de Sousa's 94 years encompassed an entire era of the Atlantic slave trade. He watched it transform from a legal enterprise to an illegal one. He adapted to every change, every new restriction, every new challenge. He outlived most of his contemporaries. He died wealthy, powerful, respected, mourned by kings and commoners alike. And he left behind more than 100 children, thousands of descendants, communities that still identify with his legacy, and a historical record that forces us to confront some of the hardest questions about how we remember the past and what we owe to those who suffered in it.